Dam level dropping. Water level approaching what I think of as being full, as demarcated by the nutgrass growing just inside the water's edge. It should be just slightly above the water's edge. Okay, g'day YouTube. How's that for a long lead in an introduction? So, 2 days. See, I didn't cough on my hand. 2 days since my COVID-19 boomer virus video. And what changes have occurred? Qantas has gone from shutting down 80% of its overseas flights to shutting down 100% of its overseas flights. Virgin has shut down entirely. Jetstar has shut down all of its overseas flights. Qantas, I think it's going to try and run 40% of its domestic flights. Tasmania has shut itself to the world. Australia has shut itself to the world. Apparently because it would be too embarrassing to say that we're shutting ourselves to Trump's America, as well as Italy and Iran and China. But the fact is that pretty much 60 or 80% of Australia's cases of coronavirus come from overseas travellers who have come to Australia from the excited status of Norte Americano. Now, a whole bunch of people are either genuinely surprised or they are feigning surprise. I don't know. How can I tell? Living out here, as I do, on the endangered species sanctuary, atop a ridge in a regrowth forest, 10 miles or 15 kilometres out of town, living off grid for kind of the past 25 years or so. And before that there was 6 years living in a little village, and before that there was 4 years living off grid, and before that there was about 3 months living off grid. What the hell do I know about what all the norms are thinking? Here I am, 59 years old, having started prepping in about 1980 when I went to the city and I studied nursing, so that when NATO and the Warsaw Pact had a shit fight and Australia contrived to get itself atom bombed by having friends in powerful places, I would be able to function in a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear Holocaust society. As a registered general nurse, I had a government job, I was at a hospital. If everything went really to shit, I could probably swap bags of potatoes for setting a broken leg or sewing up a wound or catching a baby if I really had to. That was kind of my game plan. Prepare to survive the ultimate inevitable collapse of the global vile age. Not a global village, a global vile age, the age of harvest everythingism, the age during which the whole idea was to take everything there is, to accumulate a massive surplus, carry that surplus to the marketplace and sell it to people who were too busy doing something else to look after their own food, shelter and clothing needs. Can you see the swamp wallaby right in the centre of the photo, of the frame? The global vile age. The civilization, the international civilization, built on the idea that it doesn't matter how badly you denude the ecology of wherever you happen to be, because after it becomes economically unviable, then you'll be able to liquidate your assets, turn the land into cash, sell it to somebody else, leave them with the environmental problem for them to fix, and you'll be able to move on to green fields, pastures anew, an unspoilt vista of broad sunlit uplands, because manifest destiny. If you have the technology, then you have the right to choose to despoil the environment anytime you think you can make a profit out of it. It's not how the swamp wallabies live. It's not how the kangaroos live. It's not how any of the Australians live, including the traditional Australian Aborigines. It is how the Europeans live. It is how the Yamnayans lived. It is how the Göbekli Tepeans lived, they who invented the broadacre agro cult of harvest everythingism 12,300 years ago in what is now southeastern Turkey, when the Göbekli Tepeans started stonemasons working on T-shaped monoliths with bas-relief animal carvings, square section, flat-faced T-shaped monoliths, and erected them mortised into square holes in the underground or surrounding limestone. The stonemasons had to be fed, and they were initially fed by hunter-gatherers carrying their huntings and their gatherings as much as 500 kilometres from all directions. And we know this because the first middens at Göbekli Tepe are 12,300 years old, and the middens are full of wild harvested grains, wild harvested nuts and seeds, and wild harvested animals. 30 years later, the very first hybrid grain appears in the midden at Göbekli Tepe. What had happened was the hunter-gatherers had carried in grain from 500 miles that way, and the grain from over there had been dropped on the ground, and it fortuitously germinated and seeded and grew up in winter and spring, and beside it there was another germinated grass seedling, proto-wheat, which came from a couple of 100 miles over that way. And the two of them happened to cross-pollinate. And the next year, at the end of winter, when the Göbekli Tepeans turned up for another summer's stone masonry, behold, among all of the natural wild harvested grains, there were these few plants that stuck up higher or had more grains per plant. 300 years later, every grain dropped in the midden was a hybrid strain. Göbekli Tepe, 12,300 years ago to 11,900 years ago, that is where the broadacre agro cult of harvest everythingism was born. 400 years later, Göbekli Tepe had been abandoned for the second time because they had created such an ecological desert surrounding the place that nobody could carry enough food in there to keep the city alive. The broadacre agro cult of harvest everythingism. Apparently, the richer people woke up to it early and they left. It was only the poor people who stayed there and died. And for 6,000 years, a sort of a proto-civilization grew up within a couple of thousand miles of Göbekli Tepe all over Europe. There were not quite villages, not quite towns, but maybe 1,000 to 3,000 people. They had carts, they had wheels, they didn't have plumbing and they didn't have sewage. And they were mostly harvesting the forest. But then, from south of the Caucasus, there came a race of tall horse herders who apparently fed their infants on horse milk. They were called the Yamnayans, and as far as I can figure it out, they were descended from the Göbekli Tepeans. Something went on which meant that there was a generation who were completely starved of family treatment, love and cuddles, because they grew up to be a whole bunch of nasty arseholes. And what they did was they set off and they conquered Europe and Asia. They went all the way to the Spanish coast. They bred with the Beaker folk. 100 years after the Göbekli Tepeans arrived in Britain, there was no Y chromosomes of British, well, there were no British Y chromosomes anywhere on the British Isles. I think, yeah, New Scientist magazine article, I first read it 6 months or a year ago. The British erected the monument at Stonehenge. 12 months later, not one British Y chromosome existed in the British Islands. 100 years from erecting Stonehenge to the Yamnayans having killed all the British men and settled down with all the British women. English, Irish, Scots, Welsh, the whole friggin' lot of them. They went all the way to Norway. They went down as far as Calcutta and Delhi, Hong Kong. The Yamnayans pretty much covered Europe, the Eurasian continent, north of the equator. And from there, their base has expanded. The Romans were copying, the Greeks were copying, the Egyptians were copying the Babylonians, who were all trying to be as all-encompassing as the Göbekli Tepeans. I, raised to be a white fella in Australia, I'm a fucking Yamnayan because my father's grandfather came from Yorkshire. 138 years ago, 1882. But yeah, I'm a Yamnayan, aren't I? Hey, if there were no British Y chromosomes in the British Isles 100 years after Stonehenge went up, then yeah, I'm essentially a Yamnayan. So here we are in 2020. What apparently happened in 2008, 2009 was that the waves of expansion from Turkey finally actually hit themselves on the other side of the world, and there was no longer any environmental surplus to be over-harvested, to be shipped back to sustain the economy of the capital city in the homeland. And if there's no environmental surplus, no economic activity is possible. And because of the inertia and the momentum of the credit creation cycle, we've managed to keep going from 2008 till 2020. And now finally, the bat eaters have brought civilization undone. Somebody decided it would be a really clever idea to wander off and catch wild bats and take them to a meat market in Wuhan. Now, people have done this in Africa and they've caused Ebola to break out. But in China, okay, the bats gave the virus to the pangolins gave the virus to the humans have now got the virus, and every human who gets the virus generates 2.68 other humans who catch the virus. Most of the people who catch the virus have a fairly mild case, 80% of them, but 20% of them, they need hospitalisation. The 20% who need hospitalisation, 75 or 80% of them are over 60. So far, nobody under 9 has died from the virus. 2% of the people who are under 19 have died, but 75% of the people who are dead are over 60. So anyone who thinks it's not a boomer virus, they're not paying attention, because the youngest boomer is 65. The older you get, the more likely you are to be wiped out by COVID-19, the boomer virus. Because people who are over 60, they own most of the money in the world. They own most of the shares in the world. They have the most influence with the governments. No matter how terrified the governments are of constraining the sacred economy, they are more scared of constraining the whims of the people who donate to their political parties and support them and maintain them. So all kinds of travel restrictions and human interaction restrictions have been brought out because anybody who's over 60, they want this fucking thing stopped. I'm 59. I haven't had a job since January 1986. So from my point of view, well, it was obvious that something was going to stop industrial fossil fueled civilization. And it seems to me that a big part of the problem with industrial civilization is the people who are running it never ever studied science or biology as an elective in high school because they didn't have to. That's what the word elective means. The people who are running the world are the people who took the humanities, commerce, economics, history, politics, political science. They think what actually matters is public opinion, which is a manipulable thing. And in one sense, they're right, because if you can get the public to be of the opinion that what we need to do is, if it moves, shoot it. If it doesn't move, chop it down. If your axe can't bite, try dynamite. And if it's too big to blow up, then rent it out for advertising space. If that's what the mass of the population believes is the correct way to live on the surface of a mud ball, orbiting a continuous hydrogen fusion reaction at a distance of 93 million miles, then that's how they're going to behave. And if that then destroys the ecology of the biosphere so that there are no longer ambient conditions suitable for a sustainable human civilization, then that really fucking matters, because it means we're all going down together. Now, the big difficulty is, as far as I can see, 240 years ago, right here, there was a functional ecology in which every human could make everything they needed with their own hands in order to get their food, shelter, and clothing. And it took them 2 hours per person per day, and they might spend 5 days a week prophylactically burning the landscape in order to maintain everything in a safe condition, but 2 hours per person per day for all their food, shelter, and clothing. And anything they made, they owned, and they could use it, or they could give it away, or they could set fire to it. Anything they gathered or they harvested, they had to give away 9/10 of it. So no matter how bad your day was, nobody went hungry at night. Today, everybody's expected to work 35 or 40 hours a week. Young people are expected to work 60 hours a week at casual jobs, minimum wage, 3 different casual jobs, and that's just to pay their rent and buy their food. And everybody's expected to pay tax, anywhere from 25 to about 45%. And then everybody's expected to pay another 10% tax on the GST. And every night somebody goes to bed hungry. And if you waved a magic wand and you picked up a tribal tablelander from his dream and brought him forward 200 or 300 years and let him go here, he would starve. Because the ecology necessary to live as a traditional tribal tableland aborigine, it's no longer there. The food plants aren't there. The food prey species aren't there. The climate's not there. The water sources aren't there. The topsoil's not there. All the goodness in Australia has been fed to the European, the American, the Asian, and the Arabian markets. You know, like Australia is a source of racing camels for Saudi Arabia and Dubai. Can you get your head around that? They brought camels to Australia with Afghans in order to negotiate the desert 150 years ago to put in the overland telegraph line. And then they let the camels go, so now they're feral. And therefore, Australia exports camels to Arabia. Or we used to before the airline shut down, because the camels can't readily survive on a boat. So they have to be flown there, air freighted. And that's no longer happening. So the Gaia hypothesis has worked with the bats and the pangolins. And between them, what they've done is they've set a virus among the entrepreneurial, fossil-fueled industrial humans. And it really sort of kind of looks as if the virus is winning big time. In the same way that during all the dystopian nuclear war type post-apocalyptic novels and scenarios, everybody was told to go and hunker down and sit out the fallout and wait for everything to get better. Well, yeah. Now everybody's being told to go home and hunker down and sit there and outwait the virus and hope that somebody will refill the supermarket while you're out waiting the virus, and then hope that somehow miraculously the whole world's economy is going to get going again so that we can take up with the whole project of shitting in the sky and making anthropogenic global warming get worse. And guess what? I think this is the biggest reduction in anthropogenic atmospheric greenhouse gas release since the Soviet Union collapsed. So the bottom line is big win for Extinction Rebellion. Greta Thunberg should be appointed head of the United Nations to tell us to pay attention to the science and get on with fixing this shit. Or at least not making it any worse. Ain't that right? Hey, what do you think? We stop making it worse? Won't that make everything relatively better if we just stop making it worse? Surely. Yeah? Hey, what do you think? So, try not to get too cranky. Such is life. Yeah? You know any swamp wallabies who are upset about the coronavirus? Because they all seem to be relaxed and comfortable, as far as I can see. Hey, you happy about coronavirus? Are you worried about coronavirus? No, not at all. See? Not a problem. Ask any swamp wallaby, because as far as they're concerned, anything that stops industrial fossil fueled economic activity, that cannot be a bad thing. Because if industrial fossil fueled activity continues unfettered the way it has been for the past 12,300 years, or, yeah, okay, let's be honest, 250 years since the first petroleum was drilled, extracted and refined. As an Aboriginal tribal elder said to me 25 years ago, he said, if the white fellas who've come here to Australia, if they're going to keep going in the same track they've been running along for the last 200 years, if they think they're going to go on doing that for another 200 years, then in 100 years there's not going to be any of them left alive. And from what I can see, that Aboriginal tribal elder, he was not wrong. So I'm really glad I paid attention and I didn't go and try and see how rich I could get and find out how many flat screen TVs I could put in every room of the mortgaged house that I never signed up for. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Life's actually pretty good if you pay attention to what matters. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Postscriptum. Perfect liberty involves perfect responsibility. How's that? Ducks on the pond. Perfect liberty involves perfect responsibility. The 60 and over generation have had perfect liberty for 42 years. What's the meaning of life? 42. For 42 years. To vote against global warming. To vote against habitat destruction. To vote against mass species extinction. And guess what? They all decided to vote in favour of continuing business as usual. All the same, situation remains secure, mixture remains the same. So when their life turns to shit, they bear perfect responsibility. Happily, your faithful correspondent here didn't fit in with that normal society picture. Therefore, thus and because, here I am, sitting on the endangered species sanctuary, trying to talk sense to the swamp wallabies and explain the ways of humanity. While at sundown the ducks fly into the dam that I put there 30 years ago, because I thought it would be a pleasant addition to the landscape. And it took me 29 years before I spent $1,500 getting the thing, no, nearly $2,000, setting it up so that I could use it as a firefighting reserve. And happily, the fire went somewhere else on the day and I never had to suck me dam dry, for which the ducks are eternally grateful. Here endeth the bonus extra features. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Keep on keeping on, because coronavirus ain't going to stop anytime soon. Ciao.